When everything you've believed in crumbles before your eyes, the pain cuts deeper than any earthly wound. Father Gabriel had lost his wife, his health, and now his faith, as corruption poisoned the very church he'd served for decades. At sunset, one evening, he took the church's Virgin Mary statue and threw it into the river. He wanted to hurt God the way God had hurt him. A week later, floods destroyed his mansion. The gentle river had turned angry and violent. Everything Gabriel owned was gone, swallowed by muddy water. He realized the sacred river was punishing him for what he did. Now he faces a choice. Leave everything behind, or dive into those dangerous waters to retrieve the statue and beg for forgiveness. Can a man who has lost everything find the courage to face divine wrath for a chance at redemption? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Augustine's parish, casting coloured shadows across the worn wooden pews where Father Gabriel had delivered countless sermons over the past 23 years. The church stood like a beacon on Riverside Drive, its white limestone walls weathered by decades of mountain winters, its bell tower reaching toward heaven with the same unwavering faith Gabriel once possessed. Gabriel sat in the front pew, Eleanor's wedding ring heavy in his palm. The simple gold band had become his most treasured possession since her death 3 years ago, a tangible connection to the woman who had made his calling feel like a blessing rather than a burden. Elena Martinez had been the daughter of the church organist when Gabriel first arrived as a young priest, fresh from seminary and burning with righteous purpose. She had challenged his homilies, questioned his interpretations, and somehow made him a better shepherd to his flock. Their courtship had been unconventional. Elena had waited until Gabriel left the priesthood to marry her, supporting him through his transition to pastoral ministry in the Methodist tradition. She understood his need to serve God while building a life together, never resenting the parishioners who called at all hours or the church meetings that stretched late into the evening. When they married in this very sanctuary, the river beyond, the church grounds had sparkled in the afternoon light as if blessing their union. The river. Gabriel's jaw tightened as he thought of those sacred waters that had once brought him such peace. For generations, the Riverside Methodist Church had held Easter baptisms in the gentle current, continuing a tradition that stretched back to the Spanish missionaries who first blessed these waters in the 1700s. The river had been Eleanor's favorite place for reflection, where she would sit with her medical journals, preparing for her work as a pediatric nurse at the county hospital. Father Gabriel, the voice, belonged to Maria Santos, an elderly parishioner whose family had attended St. Augustine's for 4 generations. At 83, Maria still arrived early every Sunday to arrange the altar flowers, her gnarled hands somehow coaxing beauty from the simplest blooms. "You've been sitting here for an hour. Are you feeling well?" Gabriel forced a smile, slipping Elena's ring into his pocket. "Just preparing for Sunday's sermon, Maria. The Lord speaks to us in quiet moments." Maria's weathered face creased with concern. She had known Gabriel since his early days at the church, had watched him grow from an idealistic young pastor into a pillar of the community. She had also watched him crumble after Eleanor's diagnosis, seen the light fade from his eyes as months of chemotherapy failed to halt the cancer that consumed the woman he adored. "That Dr. Chen called again," Maria said gently. "Something about Eleanor's memorial fund." She seemed upset. Gabriel's stomach clenched. Dr. Sarah Chen had been Elena's oncologist, one of the few physicians who had genuinely cared about her patients as people rather than cases. Elena had spoken of her with deep respect, praising Dr. Chen's compassion. During the darkest months of treatment, the Memorial Scholarship Fund they had established in Elena's name was supposed to help young women pursue nursing careers, continuing Elena's legacy of healing. "I'll call her back," Gabriel murmured. Though he already suspected what Dr. Chen wanted to discuss, the diocese's financial troubles had been growing worse each month, and Gabriel had heard whispers about programs being cut, charities being defunded. The heavy oak doors at the church's entrance creaked open, and Father Thomas appeared, his youthful energy a stark contrast to Gabriel's weary demeanor. At 32, Thomas possessed the same fervor Gabriel remembered from his own early ministry, the unshakable belief that faith could move mountains and heal any wound. "Gabriel, there you are," Thomas said, his voice echoing in the empty sanctuary. "Bishop Morales wants to see you this afternoon." Something about the quarterly reports. The mention of Bishop Morales sent a chill through Gabriel's chest. Ricardo. Morales had been appointed to oversee the mountain diocese 5 years ago, arriving with promises of modernization and fiscal responsibility. Instead, he had brought an atmosphere of secrecy and control that made Gabriel's skin crawl. The quarterly financial meetings had become exercises in creative accounting, with Morales explaining away discrepancies with vague references to administrative costs and diocesan overhead. Gabriel's mansion sat on the hill overlooking the church, a testament to better times, when donations flowed freely and the parish thrived. He had built it during the early years of his marriage to Elena, when the church's building fund had excess money and the bishop had encouraged pastors to establish themselves as community leaders. Now, the house felt like a monument to his pride, its empty rooms echoing with memories of dinner parties and holiday gatherings that would never come again. The financial records lay spread across his study desk, and Gabriel forced himself to review them one more time before his meeting with the bishop. The numbers told a story of steady decline, membership dropping, donations shrinking, maintenance costs rising. But buried within the columns of figures were discrepancies that made Gabriel's hands tremble with anger. The children's hospital, wing that Elena had championed before her death, had been fully funded by parish donations, yet the money had somehow been redirected to emergency diocese needs. The free medical clinic that Dr. Chen had hoped to establish had lost its funding to administrative restructuring. Most painful of all, Elena's memorial scholarship had been dissolved last month, its remaining balance transferred to the bishop's discretionary fund. Gabriel stared at Elena's photograph on his desk, her gentle smile now seeming to mock his failure. To protect her memory, she had believed in the church's mission so deeply, had trusted that her legacy would help others long after her death. Instead, her sacrifice had been reduced to line items in a corrupt bishop's ledger book. The telephone rang, interrupting his brooding. Dr. Chen's voice carried barely contained frustration as she explained that the scholarship recipients had been notified that their funding would be terminated immediately. 3 young women would have to abandon their nursing studies, their dreams crushed by the church's broken promises. "I don't understand, Gabriel," Dr. Chen said. "Elena made me promise that this program would continue. She said the church was her family, that they would honor her memory. What happened to that money?" Gabriel gripped the receiver so tightly his knuckles went white. He knew exactly what had happened to that money. It had disappeared into the same black hole that had swallowed countless other charitable funds, feeding the bishop's expensive tastes and mysterious consulting fees. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across his study, Gabriel made a decision that would change everything. He could no longer pretend that the corruption would somehow resolve itself. He could no longer protect a system that had betrayed everything Elena had believed in. The Virgin Mary statue stood in the church's side chapel, her marble face serene and compassionate. For decades she had watched over the congregation, her presence a symbol of divine mercy and maternal love. Tonight, she would become something else entirely, a weapon in Gabriel's war against heaven itself. The bishop's office reeked of expensive cologne and Cuban cigars, a sharp contrast to the humble quarters Gabriel maintained at the church. Bishop Ricardo Morales sat behind a mahogany desk that cost more than most parishioners earned in a year, his manicured fingers drumming against a leather portfolio filled with financial documents that would never see the light of day. "Gabriel, my friend," Morales said, his voice carrying the smooth charm that had fooled so many for so long. "Please, sit. We have much to discuss." Gabriel remained standing, his eyes fixed on the framed photographs that decorated the bishop's walls. There was Morales with the governor, Morales with wealthy donors, Morales blessing the groundbreaking of a luxury resort that had somehow received church funding. Not a single image showed him with the poor, the sick, or the struggling families that comprised the majority of their congregations. "The quarterly reports show some concerning trends," Morales continued, opening the portfolio with theatrical precision. "Your parish donations are down significantly, and I'm afraid we'll need to make some difficult adjustments. Adjustments like stealing Elena's memorial fund." Gabriel's voice came out as a growl, surprising them both with its intensity. Morales's carefully composed expression flickered for just a moment before resuming its practiced neutrality. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Gabriel. All diocesan funds are allocated according to the greatest need." "The greatest need?" Gabriel stepped closer to the desk, his hands clenched into fists. "Elena's scholarship was helping 3 young women become nurses. Women from families too poor to afford medical school. That was Elena's dream, Ricardo. She made me promise." "Your wife was a wonderful woman," Morales interrupted, his tone shifting to patronizing sympathy. "But she wasn't a financial administrator. She didn't understand the complexities of diocesan management." The portfolio lay open between them, and Gabriel could see enough of the documents to confirm his worst suspicions. There were invoices for consulting services from companies that didn't exist, receipts for administrative travel to vacation destinations, and most damning of all, a bank statement showing a personal account in Morales's name that had received regular transfers from the Children's Hospital Fund. "How long have you been stealing from us?" Gabriel's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of 23 years of faithful service. "How many children went without medical care so you could buy another $1,000 suit?" Morales stood abruptly, his mask of civility finally slipping. "Be very careful, Gabriel. You're speaking to your bishop, and I won't tolerate accusations." "Accusations?" Gabriel laughed bitterly. "I'm looking at the evidence, Ricardo. Elena's cancer treatment could have been funded by that hospital money. The experimental therapy that Dr. Chen recommended, the one that might have saved her life, we couldn't afford it because you had already stolen the money that was supposed to help people like her." The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence, heavy with years of suppressed rage and grief. Gabriel had never spoken these thoughts aloud, had barely allowed himself to think them, but now they poured out of him like a dam bursting. "Elena died believing the church would honor her memory," Gabriel continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "She died believing that her suffering meant something, that it would help others avoid the same fate. But you've turned her sacrifice into just another line item in your personal bank account." Morales sat back down, his face flushed with anger and what might have been shame. "The diocese operates under complex financial pressures that you couldn't possibly understand. Sometimes we must make difficult choices." "Difficult choices?" Gabriel slammed his palm against the desk, causing the bishop to flinch. "You chose a luxury car over Elena's life. You chose vacation homes over children's medicine. You chose your own comfort over everything we're supposed to stand for." The bishop's office suddenly felt suffocating, its expensive furnishings and religious artwork now seeming like props in an elaborate deception. Gabriel had spent years making excuses for the church's failings, convincing himself that the corruption was limited to a few bad actors, that the institution itself remained pure. Now he saw the truth with devastating clarity. The rot went all the way to the top, and he had been complicit through his silence. "I want the memorial fund restored immediately," Gabriel said, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest. "Every penny that was taken plus interest, and I want a full audit of every charitable program that's been defunded in the past 5 years." Morales's laugh was cold and calculating. "You're in no position to make demands, Gabriel. Your own financial management has been questionable at best. That mansion of yours, for instance, built with parish donations during more prosperous times, some might call that theft as well." The accusation hit Gabriel like a physical blow. The house had been built during the church's peak years, when donations flowed freely and the building fund had genuine surpluses. But Morales was right about one thing. Gabriel had used church money to build his dream home with Elena, justifying it as necessary for his pastoral duties and community leadership. "That house was approved by the previous bishop," Gabriel said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The building committee voted unanimously. The previous bishop was naive, and you took advantage of that naivety," Morales replied smoothly. "Perhaps it's time for you to consider whether you're truly suited for pastoral leadership. Your recent behavior has been erratic, your sermons increasingly political. Some parishioners have expressed concerns about your mental state." Gabriel felt the walls closing in around him. Everything he had built, everything he had worked for, was crumbling beneath the weight of corruption and compromise. Elena was gone, her memory desecrated by the very institution they had both served. The church that had once been his calling now felt like a prison, its sacred mission perverted by men like Morales, who saw faith as a business opportunity. The drive back to St. Augustine's passed in a blur of rage and despair. Gabriel's hands shook on the steering wheel as he replayed the conversation, each word cutting deeper than the last. By the time he reached the church parking lot, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that reminded him of the fires of hell. The church stood empty in the fading light, its sanctuary dark except for the eternal flame that burned beside the altar. Gabriel walked slowly down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing in the vast space where he had preached thousands of sermons about love, forgiveness, and redemption. How many lies had he unknowingly told from this pulpit? How many false promises had he made in God's name? The Virgin Mary statue stood in her alcove, surrounded by flickering votive candles left by parishioners seeking her intercession. Her marble face was serene and compassionate, her arms outstretched in eternal welcome. For 23 years, Gabriel had found comfort in her presence, but tonight she seemed to mock him with her peaceful expression. "Where were you?" Gabriel whispered to the statue, his voice cracking with emotion. "Where were you when Elena was dying? Where were you when they stole her memory? Where were you when I needed you most?" The statue offered no response. Her silence, as profound as God's had been throughout Gabriel's darkest hours. In that moment, Gabriel understood that he had been praying to stone and plaster, seeking comfort from symbols that meant nothing, trusting in a divine presence that had either abandoned him or never existed at all. Gabriel stood before the Virgin Mary statue as darkness settled over the church, his chest tight with a rage that had been building for 3 years. The votive candles cast dancing shadows across the marble figure's face, making her expression seem to shift between compassion and condemnation. In his pocket, Elena's wedding ring pressed against his palm like a burning coal. "You promised," Gabriel whispered, his voice echoing in the empty sanctuary. "You promised that faith would be rewarded, that good people would be protected, that love would conquer death. But you lied." The statue remained silent, her outstretched arms offering comfort Gabriel could no longer accept. Everything she represented, mercy, protection, divine love, had proven to be an elaborate deception. Elena had prayed to this same statue during her chemotherapy treatments, lighting candles and whispering desperate pleas for healing. The Virgin had listened to every prayer and answered with silence. Gabriel's hands trembled as he approached the alcove. The statue was heavier than he expected, her marble form solid and cool against his palms. For a moment he hesitated, remembering the day she had been installed in the church. Elena had been there, helping to arrange the flowers around the base, her face glowing with the same faith that Gabriel had once shared. "I'm sorry, Elena," Gabriel murmured, lifting the statue from her pedestal, "but I can't keep pretending anymore." The walk to the river took only minutes, but each step felt like a journey into damnation. The path behind the church led through a grove of cottonwood trees that Elena had loved, their leaves rustling in the evening breeze like whispered prayers. Gabriel had proposed to Elena here, beside these sacred waters, promising to love and protect her for all their days together. The river ran dark and smooth in the twilight, its surface reflecting the first stars of evening. This was where they had held countless baptisms, where generations of believers had proclaimed their faith and washed away their sins. The water had always seemed holy to Gabriel, blessed by centuries of worship and devotion. Now it would become the repository of his rage. Gabriel stood on the bank, holding the statue against his chest like a child. Part of him still hoped for some divine intervention, some sign that would restore his faith and heal his broken heart. But heaven remained silent, offering no comfort to a man whose world had crumbled around him. "If you're real," Gabriel said, addressing the God who had abandoned him, "then stop me. Send your angels, part the waters, do something to prove that any of this matters." The only response was the gentle sound of water flowing over stones, the same peaceful murmur that had soothed Gabriel's soul for so many years. Tonight it sounded like mockery, with a cry that contained 3 years of suppressed grief and rage. Gabriel hurled the Virgin Mary statue into the river. She disappeared beneath the surface with barely a splash, sinking into the dark water like a stone. For a moment, Gabriel felt a savage satisfaction, as if he had finally struck back against the divine forces that had betrayed him. Then the magnitude of what he had done crashed over him like a wave. He had desecrated a sacred object, violated every oath he had taken as a pastor, and committed an act that would destroy his ministry if discovered. Yet beneath the horror was a strange sense of relief, as if he had finally stopped pretending to believe in promises that would never be kept. Gabriel walked back to the church in a daze, his legs unsteady and his mind reeling. The empty alcove, where the statue had stood, seemed to accuse him with its shadows, but he forced himself to extinguish the votive candles and lock the sanctuary doors. Tomorrow he would have to explain the statue's absence, fabricate some story about cleaning or repair. Tonight, he simply wanted to escape to his empty mansion and lose himself in the bottle of whiskey that had been gathering dust since Elena's funeral. 3 days passed in a blur of guilt and defiance. Gabriel went through the motions of his pastoral duties, visiting the sick, counseling the troubled, and preparing for Sunday's service. But his heart wasn't in any of it, and he could see the concern growing in his parishioners' eyes. Maria Santos brought him casseroles he barely touched. Father Thomas offered to help with the weekly bulletin, and Dr. Chen called twice to discuss the memorial fund's restoration. Gabriel deflected their concern with practiced smiles and vague assurances, but inside he felt like a man walking on thin ice, waiting for the inevitable moment when everything would collapse beneath him. The empty alcove in the church seemed to grow more accusatory each day, and Gabriel found himself avoiding the sanctuary whenever possible. It was Maria who first noticed the weather changing. She mentioned it during their Wednesday evening prayer group, commenting on how strange it seemed to see storm clouds gathering when the forecast had called for clear skies. Gabriel barely listened, his attention focused on the growing list of parish problems that seemed to multiply with each passing day. The first sign that something was genuinely wrong came that Thursday evening. Gabriel was working late in his study trying to balance the church's increasingly desperate finances when he heard the sound of rushing water outside his window. The river, which had been running low due to the drought, was suddenly swollen and turbulent. Gabriel stepped onto his back porch and stared at the transformation in amazement. The gentle stream that had meandered peacefully behind his property for decades was now a churning torrent, its banks straining to contain waters that seemed to have appeared from nowhere. The sound was different too. Instead of the soothing babble he had grown accustomed to, the river roared like an angry beast. Weather reports on the local news made no mention of significant rainfall in the watershed, and the meteorologists seemed genuinely puzzled by the sudden flooding. Gabriel watched the coverage with growing unease, remembering childhood stories about the river that his grandmother used to tell. She had been part Navajo, and her tales had been filled with spirits and sacred places that demanded respect from mortals. As a rational man and a Christian pastor, Gabriel had always dismissed such stories as folklore, but now, watching the impossible floodwaters surge past his property, he began to wonder if there might be more truth in the old tales than he had ever imagined. The river continued to rise throughout the night, and Gabriel found himself drawn to the window repeatedly, unable to shake the feeling that the water was somehow watching him. By morning, the flood had claimed several low-lying properties downstream, and emergency services were scrambling to evacuate threatened areas. Gabriel's mansion sat on higher ground, but even so, he could see water lapping at the edges of his carefully manicured lawn. The river had never come this close to his house before, not even during the spring runoff that typically brought the highest water levels of the year. Standing at his bedroom window with Eleanor's wedding ring clutched in his hand, Gabriel began to suspect that his act of desecration might have consequences he had never imagined. By Friday morning, the river had transformed into something Gabriel barely recognized. The water ran thick and brown with sediment, carrying debris that shouldn't exist in a mountain stream. Broken branches, pieces of metal roofing, and stranger things that Gabriel preferred not to examine too closely. The sound had changed again too, from the roar of rushing water to something that almost resembled voices, whispering in an unknown language. Gabriel stood in his bedroom, staring at Elena's jewelry box on the dresser. The wooden container had been her grandmother's, passed down through 3 generations of strong-willed women who had faced hardship with grace and faith. Inside, Elena's cross necklace lay nestled in faded velvet, a simple silver piece she had worn every day of their marriage. As Gabriel watched, the necklace began to move. At first, he thought it was his imagination, a trick of the morning light, filtering through the curtains. But the cross was definitely shifting position, turning slowly, as if moved by an invisible hand. Gabriel rubbed his eyes and looked again, but the phenomenon continued. The delicate silver chain seemed to writhe, like a living thing, and the cross itself had begun to glow with a faint pearl-like luminescence. "Elena," Gabriel whispered, reaching toward the jewelry box with trembling fingers. The moment he touched the necklace, it went still. The glow faded, leaving only ordinary silver that felt surprisingly warm against his palm. Gabriel clutched the cross to his chest, his heart racing with a mixture of hope and terror. For 3 days, he had felt nothing but emptiness where his faith used to be. Now something was stirring in the spiritual realm, responding to his act of desecration with power he couldn't understand. The telephone rang, jarring Gabriel from his contemplation. Dr. Chen's voice carried a note of urgency that immediately put him on alert. "Gabriel, I need to see you right away," she said without preamble. "Something's happened with Elena's scholarship fund that you need to know about." They met at the hospital cafeteria, a sterile space filled with the quiet desperation of families, waiting for news about loved ones. Dr. Chen looked older than Gabriel remembered, her usually immaculate appearance showing signs of strain and sleepless nights. "The diocese just called," she began, sliding a folder across the table toward Gabriel. "They're not just cancelling Elena's scholarship. They're demanding repayment of all funds already distributed. They claim there were irregularities in the initial setup. Gabriel opened the folder and stared at the legal documents inside. The diocese's lawyers had crafted a masterpiece of bureaucratic cruelty, using technical language to void Elena's carefully planned legacy and reclaim money that had already been spent on tuition and medical textbooks. They can't do this, Gabriel said, though he could hear the uncertainty in his own voice. Elena worked with the diocese's financial advisor to set up this fund. Everything was properly documented. That financial advisor was reassigned 6 months ago, Dr. Chen interrupted. His replacement claims there's no record of the proper approvals. Gabriel, they're saying Elena never had the authority to establish this fund in the first place. The words hit Gabriel like physical blows. Not only had Bishop Morales stolen Elena's money, but now he was attacking her reputation, making it seem as if she had somehow acted improperly in trying to help young women pursue nursing careers. The 3 scholarship recipients are devastated, Dr. Chen continued. They've already started classes, taken out additional loans to cover living expenses. If they have to repay this money immediately, they'll be forced to drop out. Gabriel closed the folder, unable to look at the documents any longer. Elena's cross necklace seemed to burn against his chest where he had tucked it inside his shirt. She would have been heartbroken to see her dream turned into a weapon against the very people she had hoped to help. There's something else, Doctor, Chen said quietly. I've been getting calls from other doctors in the diocese. Charity programs that Elena supported, the free clinic, the medical equipment fund, the Children's Health Initiative, they're all being dissolved. The money is disappearing into administrative costs and emergency reserves. Gabriel felt a familiar rage building in his chest, the same fury that had driven him to throw the Virgin Mary statue into the river. But this time, the anger was mixed with something else, a cold certainty that actions had consequences, that the universe kept its own accounts, and that payment was coming due. As if summoned by his thoughts, Father Thomas appeared at their table, his youthful face pale with concern. Gabriel, thank God I found you, Thomas said, slightly out of breath. There's been an incident at the church. The police want to speak with you. The drive back to St. Augustine's passed in tense silence. Gabriel's mind raced through possibilities, each worse than the last. Had someone discovered the missing statue? Had his confrontation with Bishop Morales been reported? Was his carefully constructed life about to collapse entirely? The church parking lot was filled with emergency vehicles, police cars, an ambulance, and the fire department's rescue truck. Gabriel's heart sank as he saw Maria Santos being helped into the ambulance, her usual composure replaced by obvious distress. What happened? Gabriel asked the first police officer he encountered. Elderly woman got trapped in the church basement when the flooding started, the officer explained. Lucky thing she had her cell phone with her, or we might not have found. For hours, the water came up fast, faster than anyone expected. Gabriel stared at the church building in disbelief. Water was seeping from the foundation, creating dark stains on the limestone walls. The basement, which had always been bone dry, was apparently flooded to a depth of several feet. How is that possible? Gabriel asked. The basement is 20 feet above the river level, the officer shrugged. Groundwater, maybe, or the storm drains backing up. All I know is that old lady was trapped down there for 2 hours before we could get her out. Gabriel watched the ambulance pull away with Maria inside, her frightened eyes meeting his through the rear window. She'd been trying to prepare the altar linens for Sunday service when the water began rising around her. The woman who had served the church faithfully for 6 decades had nearly drowned in a basement that should have been completely safe. As the emergency responders packed up their equipment, Gabriel noticed something that made his blood run cold. The floodwater that had filled the basement wasn't the muddy brown torrent from the river. It was crystal clear, as if it had come from a pure mountain spring. And in the afternoon sunlight, It seemed to glow with the same pearl-like luminescence he had seen in Elena's cross necklace that morning. 1 week after Gabriel had thrown the Virgin Mary statue into the river, he woke to the sound of water lapping against his bedroom window. The impossibility of it took several seconds to register. His bedroom was on the second floor of the mansion, 30 feet above the normal river level. Yet there it was, the unmistakable sound of waves washing against glass. Gabriel stumbled to the window and pulled back the curtains, his mind struggling to process what he saw. The entire valley had become a lake, with only the tops of trees, and the highest buildings visible above the surface. His mansion, built on what he had thought was safe high ground, was now an island surrounded by dark water that reflected the early morning sky like a mirror. The flooding had come silently. During the night, without the violent rush he might have expected from a broken dam or sudden storm. Instead, the water had simply risen with supernatural patience, claiming the land inch by inch until Gabriel's world had been transformed beyond recognition. In his study, the holy water font that had belonged to his grandmother was bubbling violently, its blessed contents roiling as if heated by an invisible flame. Gabriel approached the small silver vessel with growing dread, remembering his grandmother's stories about water that could judge the souls of men. The holy water had never reacted to anything in the 15 years since her death, but now it seemed to be boiling with righteous fury. Gabriel reached for the font, then jerked his hand back as the metal surface burned his fingertips. The holy water wasn't just bubbling, it was literally boiling, sending up wisps of steam that smelled faintly of incense and something else he couldn't identify. Something that reminded him of Elena's perfume on their wedding day. The sound of a boat engine drew Gabriel back to the window. A police rescue craft was navigating between the submerged trees, its occupants clearly struggling to understand the scope of the disaster. The radio chatter that drifted across the water spoke of a 100-year flood and unprecedented rainfall, but Gabriel knew better. This was no natural disaster. A sharp knock at the front door interrupted his brooding. Gabriel waded through the ankle-deep water that now covered his mansion's main floor, wondering who could possibly be visiting in the middle of what the news was calling the worst flooding in the region's recorded history. Bishop Morales stood on the front porch, his expensive Italian shoes soaked and his usually immaculate appearance disheveled. Behind him, a church maintenance boat bobbed in the floodwater, its elderly operator looking thoroughly uncomfortable with his unusual passenger. "Gabriel," Morales said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "We need to talk, now." They sat in Gabriel's waterlogged living room, the bishop perched uncomfortably on a sofa that squished with every movement. Gabriel remained standing, unwilling to show his enemy even the courtesy of shared misery. "The statue is missing," Morales said without preamble. "The Virgin Mary from your church. Where is it?" Gabriel felt his heart skip, but he kept his expression neutral. "Missing? What do you mean?" "Don't play games with me, Gabriel. Half the churches in the diocese are reporting supernatural phenomena, statues moving, holy water boiling, flood damage in places that should be geographically impossible to flood. And it all started when your statue disappeared." The bishop leaned forward, his eyes glittering with something that might have been fear. "There are things about this diocese that you don't understand, Gabriel. Things that go back to the founding of the first missions. The Spanish priests didn't just build churches here, they built on top of something much older." Gabriel remained silent, but his mind was racing. His grandmother's stories came flooding back, tales of sacred springs and spirit waters that had been worshipped by the native peoples long before the Europeans arrived. He had always assumed they were just folklore, but now those half-remembered legends seemed to carry the weight of truth. "The river has been blessed and consecrated for over 300 years, Morales continued. "Every Easter baptism, every blessing ceremony, every prayer said over those waters has accumulated power, and something has awakened that power, turned it against us." "Against us?" Gabriel couldn't keep the bitterness out of his voice. Or against you specifically, Ricardo. Maybe the river has finally had enough of watching you steal from the poor. Morales flinched, as if struck. You don't understand the forces you're dealing with, Gabriel. This isn't about corruption or church politics. This is about spiritual. A warfare on a scale you can't imagine. If we don't find that statue and restore it to its proper place, the flooding won't stop. It will consume everything. As if summoned by the bishop's words, the sound of cracking wood echoed through the mansion. Gabriel rushed to the window and saw that several of the support beams for his dock had snapped, unable to withstand the unnatural pressure of the rising water. His beautiful lakefront property was literally being torn apart by the forces he had unleashed. "Where is the statue, Gabriel?" Morales demanded, his composure finally cracking. "I know you took it. Your behavior, your accusations against me, the timing of its disappearance, it all points to you." Gabriel stared at the bishop, seeing him clearly for the first time. The man who had presented himself as a spiritual leader was revealed as nothing more than a frightened bureaucrat, desperately trying to shift blame for consequences he couldn't control. "Even if I knew where it was," Gabriel said slowly, "why would I tell you? You've stolen from every charity Elena ever supported. You've turned the church into your personal bank account. Maybe this flood is exactly what you deserve." Morales stood abruptly, water sloshing around his ankles. "You fool! Do you think this punishment will stop with me? Look around you, Gabriel. Your house is flooding too. Your parishioners are suffering. Innocent people are losing their homes because of your selfish act of rebellion." The words hit Gabriel like a physical blow because they carried the sting of truth. Maria Santos had nearly drowned in the church basement. Families throughout the valley were being evacuated from homes that had stood safely for generations. Whatever justice the river was dispensing, it wasn't precisely targeted. It was consuming everything in its path. But before Gabriel could respond, another sound cut through the air. The distant wail of emergency sirens mixed with something else that made his blood run cold. It was screaming. Human voices raised in terror, coming from the direction of the town center. Both men rushed to the front window, and Gabriel felt his knees nearly buckle at what he saw. The floodwater was no longer the dark brown of river sediment or the crystal clear of mountain springs. Now it glowed with an eerie phosphorescence that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. And within that luminous water, shapes were moving. Not debris or fish, but forms that looked almost human. "Dear God," Morales whispered, making the sign of the cross with shaking hands. "It's the spirits of everyone who was ever baptized in that river. The water remembers them all." Gabriel watched in horrified fascination as translucent figures drifted past his window, their faces serene, but their eyes filled with an otherworldly intelligence. He recognized some of them, parishioners he had baptized himself, members of the community who had passed away over the decades. They moved through the glowing water like guardian angels, but their presence felt more like a judgment than a blessing. "They're looking for something," Gabriel realized, his voice barely above a whisper, "or someone." As if responding to his words, several of the ghostly figures turned toward the mansion, their luminous eyes fixed on Gabriel through the window, and he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold flood water around his ankles. Elena was among them. She looked exactly as she had on their wedding day, young, radiant, filled with hope and love. But her expression held a sadness that pierced Gabriel's heart more deeply than any accusation. She didn't speak, but her message was clear. She knew what he had done, and she was disappointed in the man her husband had become. "Eleanor," Gabriel breathed, pressing his hand against the window glass. She shook her head slowly, then pointed toward the river with one translucent finger. The meaning was unmistakable. The statue needed to be returned to its rightful place. Only then would the spiritual forces he had unleashed be appeased. Bishop Morales grabbed Gabriel's arm, his grip desperate and painful. "You have to tell me where it is, Gabriel. These spirits, they're not just watching, they're judging. And if we don't make this right, the judgment will fall on all of us." Gabriel looked at the bishop's terrified face, then back at Elena's disappointed expression. For the first time since throwing the statue into the river, he began to understand the true magnitude of what he had done. His act of rebellion hadn't just been against the corrupt church hierarchy. It had been against centuries of faith, hope, and sacred tradition. The holy water in his study was boiling more violently now, sending up clouds of steam that formed shapes in the air, crosses, doves, and other religious symbols that dissolved as quickly as they appeared. The very foundations of his mansion groaned under the pressure of water that defied every natural law. Gabriel closed his eyes and made his choice. When he opened them again, Elena's spirit had moved closer to the window, her hand pressed against the glass opposite his own. Through their joined palms, he felt a warmth that reminded him of their first kiss, their wedding vows, and every moment of happiness they had shared. "It's in the river," Gabriel said, his voice heavy with exhaustion and regret. "I threw it in the night of my meeting with you. It's somewhere in the deepest part of the channel, probably buried in mud by now." Morales released his grip on Gabriel's arm, relief and terror warring in his expression. "Then we have to get it back. Whatever it takes, however deep we have to dive." "No," Gabriel interrupted, still staring into Elena's luminous eyes. "This isn't your burden to bear, Ricardo. You caused the pain that drove me to this moment. But the sin is mine alone. If anyone is going to face whatever's waiting in that water, it should be me." Elena's spirit smiled then, the first expression of approval Gabriel had seen from her since her death. She nodded once, then began to fade, her form dissolving into the glowing water like mist in the morning sun. But her final words echoed in Gabriel's mind with crystal clarity. "The river remembers everything, my love. But it also forgives those who have the courage to seek redemption." The second day of the Great Flood brought revelations that shattered Gabriel's understanding of everything he thought he knew about faith, redemption, and the price of spiritual warfare. As dawn broke over the transformed valley, the glowing water had receded slightly, but its supernatural luminescence had only grown stronger. The spirits that moved within its depths were no longer content to simply watch. They had begun to act. Gabriel woke to find his bedroom filled with the scent of Elena's perfume and the sound of her voice humming their wedding song. For a moment, caught between sleep and waking, he allowed himself to believe she had returned to him. But as consciousness took hold, he realized the truth was both more wonderful and more terrible than he had dared to hope. Elena's spirit stood at the foot of their bed, more solid and present than she had appeared the previous day. She wore the simple white dress she had been buried in, but her face carried an expression of serene purpose that reminded Gabriel of the woman who had once challenged bishops and confronted corruption without fear. "The confession booth, Gabriel," she said, her voice carrying the weight of eternity. "You need to use the confession booth." Gabriel sat up in bed, his heart pounding. "Elena, The key is burning because you haven't truly confessed," she interrupted, her tone gentle but implacable. "Not to Ricardo, not to yourself, and certainly not to God. Until you speak the words aloud in the place where confession is meant to happen, the water will continue to rise." Gabriel's hand went instinctively to his pocket, where the ornate brass, heat of the church's confession booth, had been burning against his leg for the past day. He had assumed it was some strange side effect of the supernatural flood, but now he understood its true meaning. The key was a test, a spiritual thermometer measuring the heat of his unconfessed sins. "I tried yesterday," Gabriel said, his voice breaking. "I went to the church, but the key was too hot to hold. I couldn't even get the booth open." Elena moved closer, and Gabriel felt the familiar warmth of her presence, not the physical heat of human contact, but the soul-deep comfort he had always found in her love. "Because you weren't ready," she said. "You were still angry, still focused on Ricardo's sins instead of your own. The river doesn't care about his corruption, Gabriel. It cares about the sacred trust you broke when you threw me into its waters." The words stung because they carried the ring of absolute truth. Gabriel had spent so much energy focusing on Bishop Morales's theft and manipulation that he had avoided confronting his own spiritual crisis. Yes, the church had failed him, but his response, the desecration of a holy object, the violation of centuries of sacred tradition, those sins belonged to him alone. "What do I need to do?" Gabriel asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "Dive," Elena said simply. "Find me in the deep water. Bring me home. But first, you have to be worthy of touching me again." She began to fade as the morning light grew stronger, but her final words echoed with perfect clarity. "Maria Santos is waiting for you at the church. She has something you need to see." The journey to St. Augustine's required Gabriel to wade through 2 feet of glowing floodwater that seemed to part around him like a liquid curtain. Other rescue workers struggling through the same area had to fight against a current that threatened to sweep them away. But Gabriel moved through the supernatural flood as if it recognized his right to pass. The church stood like an island in the transformed landscape, its white limestone walls rising above the luminous water with ethereal beauty. Maria Santos waited on the front steps, her elderly frame wrapped in a blanket, but her eyes bright with purpose. "Father Gabriel," she said, using the title he had abandoned when he left the Catholic priesthood decades ago, "I've been waiting for you. There are things you need to know about this river, about this church, about the responsibility you inherited when you accepted this calling." She led him inside the sanctuary, where the floodwater had somehow penetrated despite the building's elevation. But instead of the muddy destruction Gabriel expected, the interior was filled with the same crystal-clear, luminescent water that seemed to enhance rather than damage the sacred space. "My grandmother was Navajo," Maria said, echoing Gabriel's own family history. "She told me stories about the time before the Spanish missions, when this river was already sacred to the people who lived here. The spirits of the water chose this place for worship long before any Christian ever set foot in this valley." She led Gabriel to the altar, where a wooden chest had been revealed by the receding floodwater. Inside, Gabriel found documents that predated the church's official founding by decades, baptismal records written in Spanish, Native American symbols carved into wooden prayer tokens, and most shocking of all, detailed accounts of miracles and supernatural events that had been systematically hidden by successive generations of church leadership. "Every pastor who has served here has been tested," Maria explained, her weathered hands turning the pages of a leather-bound journal. "The river spirit, some call it the Holy Spirit, others use older names. It chooses those who are worthy to serve as guardians of the sacred waters, but it also tests them, sometimes in ways that break them completely." Gabriel read account after account of pastors who had faced crises of faith, supernatural challenges, and spiritual trials that seemed designed to either purify or destroy them. Some had emerged stronger and more compassionate, their ministries transformed by direct encounters with the divine. Others had fled, unable to bear the weight of genuine spiritual responsibility. Father Martinez in 1887 threw a crucifix into the river during a drought, Maria read from one entry. The floods came 3 days later and didn't stop until he retrieved it with his own hands. Father Thompson in 1923 tried to sell the church's silver communion set to pay gambling debts. The river rose to the church doors and wouldn't recede, until he confessed publicly and made restitution to every family he had wronged. Gabriel stared at the journal entries, seeing his own crisis reflected in the struggles of men who had wrestled with faith and doubt in this same place. He wasn't the first pastor to be broken by corruption and loss, and he wouldn't be the last to face judgment from forces beyond human understanding. "The confession booth key," Maria said, producing an identical brass key from her pocket. "Every Pastor receives one, but most never learn what it really opens. It's not just a door, Gabriel. It's a gateway, a place where human sin meets divine mercy, where the guilty can speak truth and find redemption. Gabriel pulled his own key from his pocket, surprised to find it merely warm instead of burning. His conversation with Elena, his growing understanding of his true situation, and Maria's revelations had apparently cooled the spiritual fire that had made the metal untouchable. "Are you ready to confess?" Maria asked, her ancient eyes holding depths of wisdom that seemed to span generations. Gabriel looked at the confession booth, its carved wooden door standing slightly ajar, as if inviting him to enter. Beyond it lay either salvation or destruction, depending on his courage to face the complete truth about himself and his failures. "I think so," Gabriel said, taking the first step toward the booth that would determine his eternal fate. The confession booth door opened at Gabriel's touch, revealing an interior that defied the laws of physics and challenged everything he thought he understood about the nature of reality. Instead of the cramped wooden chamber he expected, Gabriel found himself standing at the entrance to what appeared to be an ancient stone chamber filled with soft golden light. The walls were covered with symbols that seemed to shift between Christian crosses and Native American spiritual markings, as if two different religious traditions were somehow occupying the same sacred space. At the center of the chamber sat a baptismal font unlike anything Gabriel had ever seen, carved from a single piece of black stone that seemed to absorb light while simultaneously radiating an inner glow. "Welcome, my son," said a voice that seemed to come from the stone itself. "You have finally found the courage to seek truth." Gabriel stepped into the chamber, feeling the confession booth door close behind him with a finality that suggested there would be no retreat from this moment. The baptismal font drew him forward like a magnet, its ancient stone surface covered with intricate carvings that told a story spanning millennia. As Gabriel approached the font, the carvings began to move, depicting scenes that unfolded like a living history book. He saw Native American shamans blessing the river long before European contact, their ceremonies creating a spiritual foundation that would endure for centuries. Then came Spanish missionaries, who recognized the sacred nature of the site and carefully incorporated the existing spiritual energy into their Christian practices. "The Virgin Mary statue," Gabriel whispered, understanding beginning to dawn. "She wasn't just a Christian symbol, was she?" "The marble came from this very riverbed," the voice confirmed, seeming to emanate from every stone surface in the chamber. "For 300 years, she stood as a bridge between the old faith and the new, honoring both traditions while serving as guardian of the sacred waters." Gabriel watched the carved figures dance across the font's surface, showing him the truth that had been hidden beneath centuries of religious doctrine. The Spanish missionaries hadn't conquered the native spirituality. They had joined with it, creating a unique synthesis that drew power from both Christian and indigenous sources. "When you threw her into the river," the voice continued, "you didn't just commit an act of desecration. You broke a covenant that has protected this valley for generations." New images flowed across the stone surface, showing Gabriel scenes of devastation that made his blood run cold. Cities underwater, people fleeing from floods that followed no natural pattern, entire communities consumed by waters that glowed with supernatural fury. This was what would happen if the covenant remained broken, not just local flooding, but a spiritual catastrophe that would spread across the entire region. "But why?" Gabriel asked, his voice echoing in the stone chamber. "Why punish innocent people for my sin?" The carvings shifted again, showing him scenes of corruption and greed that extended far beyond Bishop Morales. Gabriel saw church leaders across the diocese who had stolen from charity funds, politicians who had diverted disaster relief money to their own projects, and business owners who had polluted the river while claiming to be environmental stewards. The spiritual realm didn't recognize the artificial boundaries humans created. When sacred trust was broken in one place, it weakened the fabric of divine protection everywhere. "You were chosen to be a guardian," the voice explained, and Gabriel realized he was no longer listening to an external presence. The words were coming from within his own heart, from a source of wisdom he had never known he possessed. "Your grandmother knew it, though she never spoke of it directly. Elena knew it too, which is why she encouraged you to accept the calling to this church." Gabriel's mind reeled as memories took on new meaning. His grandmother's stories about the river spirits weren't just folklore. They were family history, passed down through generations of people who had served as bridges between the natural and supernatural worlds. Elena's insistence on supporting the church's charitable work wasn't just Christian compassion. It was her way of maintaining the spiritual balance that kept the covenant strong. "I broke faith," Gabriel said, the words tearing from his throat. Like a confession born of absolute despair. "I let corruption and grief turn me away from my true calling. I failed Elena, I failed the church, and I failed the sacred trust that was placed in my hands." The baptismal font began to fill with water that seemed to well up from deep within the earth. As Gabriel watched, the liquid took on the same luminescent quality he had seen in the flood outside, but here in this sacred space, the glow felt warm and welcoming rather than threatening. "True confession requires more than words," the voice said, and Gabriel understood that he was speaking to himself, to the part of his soul that had always known the truth, but had been too afraid to acknowledge it. "You must be willing to face the full consequences of your choices." Gabriel looked into the glowing water and saw Elena's face reflected in its depths. Not the disappointed spirit who had appeared in his bedroom, but the living woman who had loved him unconditionally and supported his calling even when it required difficult sacrifices. "She's still down there," Gabriel realized, his voice filled with wonder and terror. "The statue isn't just a symbol, it's her. All the prayers that were offered to it, all the faith that was invested in it, all the love and hope it represented, it's become a living embodiment of everything we believed in." The carvings on the font showed him the final piece of the puzzle. When objects received centuries of prayer and devotion, they didn't just remain inanimate symbols, they became vessels for the spiritual energy that had been directed toward them. The Virgin Mary statue had absorbed 300 years of worship, becoming a genuine spiritual presence that served as guardian of the sacred waters. "To retrieve her," Gabriel said, speaking to his own reflection in the luminous water, "I would have to dive to the deepest part of the river. And if I'm not spiritually prepared, if I'm not worthy to touch something that's sacred..." The water in the font began to churn, showing Gabriel visions of what awaited him in the depths. He saw the statue glowing at the bottom of the river channel, surrounded by the spirits of everyone who had ever been baptized in these waters. They weren't malevolent, but they were testing every soul that approached their sacred guardian. "The choice is yours," Gabriel said to himself, finally understanding that the voice had always been his own conscience, speaking with the wisdom of generations who had faced similar trials. "You can flee like so many others have done, or you can accept the responsibility that comes with genuine spiritual calling." Gabriel reached toward the glowing water, knowing that once he touched it, there would be no turning back. His decision would determine not only his own fate, but the spiritual future of everyone who depended on the sacred covenant he had broken. The water felt warm against his fingertips, and in that moment of contact, Gabriel finally understood what it truly meant to have faith. Gabriel emerged from the confession booth transformed, carrying within his chest a certainty that felt as solid as bedrock. The supernatural chamber had vanished, leaving only the familiar wooden interior of the confession booth, but the knowledge he had gained there remained crystal clear. He understood now what needed to be done, and more importantly, he understood why he was the only one who could do it. Maria Santos waited in the sanctuary, her ancient face reflecting a mix of hope and concern. She had witnessed other pastors emerge from that booth over the decades, Some enlightened and renewed, others broken by truths too heavy for human hearts to bear. "You know what you have to do," she said, studying Gabriel's transformed expression. "I have to dive to retrieve the statue," Gabriel replied, his voice steady with newfound purpose. "But first, I need to prepare myself properly. This isn't just about physical courage, it's about spiritual readiness." Gabriel spent the afternoon gathering the items he would need for his descent into the sacred waters. Elena's silver cross, necklace, which had belonged to her grandmother, would serve as both protection and connection to the woman whose memory had been violated by his act of desecration. His ordination cross, the simple wooden piece he had received when first called to ministry, carried 23 years of pastoral service and would help him maintain his spiritual identity in the supernatural depths. But most important was his grandmother's St. Christopher medal, a worn piece of silver that had been blessed by a Navajo medicine woman before being consecrated by a Catholic priest. It represented the same synthesis of traditions that had created the sacred covenant he needed to restore. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived at the church as Gabriel was making his preparations, her medical bag in hand and her face etched with concern. "Gabriel, you can't be serious about this," she said, watching him test the waterproof case that would protect the religious artifacts during his dive. "The current down there is unpredictable. The visibility is near zero, and we have no idea how deep. The statue might have sunk." "I have to try, Sarah," Gabriel replied, securing Elena's necklace inside the protective case. "You've seen what's happening to the valley. The flooding isn't following any natural pattern, and it's getting worse every day. Emergency services are overwhelmed, and people are starting to panic." Father Thomas had arrived with a small boat, his youthful face grave with the weight of responsibility. As Gabriel's potential successor, he understood that the future of their spiritual community depended on the success of this desperate mission. "I've been researching the old records," Thomas said, helping Gabriel load diving equipment into the boat. "Maria was right about the other pastors who faced similar trials. But Gabriel, some of them didn't survive their encounters with the river spirit. Are you sure you're ready for this?" Gabriel paused in his preparations, considering the young priest's question with the seriousness it deserved. He wasn't sure of anything except the certainty that burned in his chest, the unshakable knowledge that this was his calling, his test, and quite possibly his chance at redemption. "Elena appeared to me again last night," Gabriel said quietly, his voice carrying a note of wonder that hadn't been there since his wife's death. "She wasn't disappointed anymore. She was proud that I was finally willing to face the truth about what I had done and take responsibility for making it right." The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains when Gabriel's small congregation gathered at the riverbank to witness his attempt at redemption. Maria Santos led them in prayer, her weathered voice carrying the strength of decades spent in faithful service. Dr. Chen stood ready with emergency medical equipment, though they all understood that if Gabriel encountered serious trouble in the supernatural depths, conventional medicine would be useless. Bishop Morales arrived, unexpectedly, his expensive car somehow navigating the flooded roads that had stopped lesser vehicles. He approached Gabriel with an expression that mixed fear, guilt, and what might have been grudging respect. "I've been thinking about our conversation," Morales said, his usual arrogance replaced by genuine humility. "About the corruption, about Elena's fund, about everything I've done to betray the trust placed in me. If you succeed in this, if you restore the covenant, I want to make things right. All of it. Every stolen dollar, every violated promise." Gabriel studied the bishop's face, seeing for the first time the frightened man beneath the polished exterior. The supernatural events of the past week had stripped away Morales's pretenses, revealing someone who was capable of genuine repentance, if given the chance. "The river will judge all of us," Gabriel said, accepting the bishop's tentative offer of redemption. "But restoration has to begin with truth, Ricardo. complete truth, no matter how much it costs. As Gabriel prepared to enter the water, Father Thomas pulled him aside for a private moment. The young priest's eyes were bright with tears he was struggling to hold back. "What if you don't come back?" Thomas asked. "What if this is the river?" Spirit's way of claiming a final sacrifice, Gabriel placed a steady hand on his young colleague's shoulder, drawing strength from the faith he saw shining in Thomas's face. "Then you'll continue the work," Gabriel said simply. "You'll serve this community with integrity. You'll protect the sacred waters, and you'll remember that genuine faith requires courage to face whatever challenges arise." The sun touched the mountain peaks as Gabriel waded into the luminous water, feeling its supernatural warmth flow around his legs like a living presence. The diving equipment felt strangely light on his shoulders, as if the river itself was supporting his weight and preparing to guide him to his destination. Elena's spirit appeared one final time, standing on the surface of the water as if it were solid ground. She wore her wedding dress, and her face glowed with the same radiant love Gabriel remembered from their happiest days together. "The statue is waiting," she said, her voice carrying across the water to reach everyone assembled on the shore. "But, Gabriel, remember, she's not just marble anymore. 300 years of faith have made her something more. Approach with reverence, speak with honesty, and trust that love is stronger than any sin." Gabriel nodded, understanding that this moment represented more than just the retrieval of a religious artifact. He was diving into the depths of his own soul, seeking redemption not just for his act of desecration, but for all the ways he had fallen short of his calling as a spiritual guardian. As he disappeared beneath the glowing surface, Gabriel felt the weight of generations watching over him. His grandmother's Navajo ancestors, the Spanish missionaries who had first blessed these waters, and all the faithful souls who had trusted in the power of forgiveness and renewal. The sacred waters closed over his head, and Gabriel began his descent into the heart of divine mystery. The underwater world that Gabriel entered defied every natural law he thought he understood. Instead of the murky darkness he expected, the river depths glowed with the same luminescent quality as the surface waters. But here, the light seemed to come from within the water itself, rather than reflecting external sources. Gabriel could see clearly for dozens of yards in every direction, and most remarkably, he found he could breathe the luminous liquid as easily as air. The St. Christopher medal around his neck pulsed with warm energy, creating a protective aura that allowed him to move through the supernatural environment without harm. Gabriel understood that this was no ordinary dive. He had entered a realm where spiritual laws superseded physical ones, where faith and intention mattered more than oxygen tanks and diving suits. As Gabriel descended toward the riverbed, he encountered the first of the guardian spirits. A translucent figure approached him through the glowing water, an elderly Native American man wearing traditional ceremonial dress. His eyes held the wisdom of centuries, and Gabriel instinctively understood that this was one of the original shamans who had first blessed these waters. "You seek to reclaim what was cast away in anger," the spirit said, his voice somehow perfectly clear despite the aquatic environment. "But retrieval requires more than good intentions. You must prove your worthiness to touch the sacred guardian." Gabriel nodded, understanding that he was about to face the first of several trials. The spirit gestured toward a series of stone pillars that rose from the riverbed like an underwater temple. Each pillar was covered with symbols that Gabriel recognized from his vision in the confession booth, a mixture of Christian crosses and Native American spiritual markings that represented the covenant between different faith traditions. "Speak the truth of your heart," the spirit commanded. "Not the words you think we wish to hear, but the deepest reality of your spiritual journey." Gabriel floated before the stone pillars, feeling the weight of centuries of spiritual tradition pressing down on him. The St. Christopher medal grew warmer against his chest, reminding him that he carried protection from both his grandmother's native heritage and Elena's Catholic faith. I threw the Virgin Mary statue into this river because I was consumed by rage and grief, Gabriel began, his voice carrying clearly through the luminous water. I blamed God for Elena's death, blamed the church for its corruption, and blamed the statue for representing promises that seemed to have been broken. The Native American spirit listened without judgment, his ancient eyes reflecting patience, earned through generations of witnessing human frailty and redemption. But I understand now that my anger was misdirected. Gabriel continued, feeling a burden lifting from his chest with each honest word. The corruption of men like Bishop Morales doesn't negate the sacred power that has blessed these waters for centuries. My personal grief doesn't justify violating a covenant that protects entire communities. A second spirit appeared, a Spanish missionary in brown robes, his face kind but stern. Gabriel recognized the type, a man who had dedicated his life to serving God and protecting the spiritual welfare of his flock. You speak of understanding, the missionary spirit said, but words alone do not restore broken covenants. What are you willing to sacrifice to repair the damage you have caused? Gabriel thought of his mansion, already partially destroyed by the supernatural flooding. He considered his position in the community, his reputation as a spiritual leader, his comfortable life built on the foundation of parish donations and denominational support. Everything, Gabriel said, the word emerging from deep within his soul. I'm willing to give up everything I've built for myself to restore the sacred trust I violated. The mansion, the comfortable salary, the respect of my peers, all of it matters less than making amends for my failure as a guardian. The two spirits exchanged a look that seemed to communicate across cultural and temporal boundaries. Gabriel felt himself being evaluated not just for his words, but for the sincerity of his intention and the depth of his spiritual transformation. A third spirit materialized from the glowing depths, Eleanor herself, but not as Gabriel had ever seen her in life. Here in the sacred waters, she radiated the same spiritual authority as the other guardians, her presence both beloved and awesomely powerful. My husband, she said, her voice carrying echoes of their wedding vows and their deepest conversations about faith and purpose. You have confessed your sin and declared your willingness to sacrifice, but the final test requires something more difficult than either confession or sacrifice. Gabriel waited, knowing that whatever Elena was about to ask of him would challenge the very core of his being. You must forgive, Elena said, her luminous form moving closer until Gabriel could feel the spiritual energy that surrounded her. Forgive Bishop Morales for his corruption. Forgive the church for its failures. Forgive God for allowing me to die. And most difficult of all, forgive yourself for being human in a world where divine love sometimes feels absent. The words hit Gabriel like a physical force, driving him to his knees on the luminous riverbed. Forgiveness had always been easy to preach, but nearly impossible to practice, especially when the wounds ran as deep as his did. But as Gabriel knelt in the sacred depths, surrounded by spirits who had faced their own trials and emerged transformed, he felt something shift within his heart, a release that was both painful and liberating, like a spiritual surgery that removed poisonous bitterness and replaced it with clean, healing light. I forgive, Gabriel said, the words emerging from the deepest part of his soul. I forgive Ricardo for his corruption, because I understand now that it came from the same human weakness that drove me to desecration. I forgive the church for failing to live up to its ideals, because institutions are only as perfect as the flawed people who serve them. I forgive God for Elena's death, because I finally understand that divine love doesn't promise freedom from suffering, but rather the strength to find meaning within it. The three guardian spirits moved closer, forming a circle around Gabriel as he knelt on the luminous riverbed. Their combined presence created a warmth that penetrated to his very core, washing away years of accumulated bitterness and grief. "And I forgive myself," Gabriel continued, tears that somehow remained liquid even in the supernatural depths flowing freely down his face. "I forgive myself for being human, for making mistakes, for allowing pain to cloud my judgment and lead me away from my true calling." The moment Gabriel spoke those final words of forgiveness, the river around him exploded with light. The guardian spirits joined hands, their combined energy creating a column of radiance that stretched from the riverbed to the surface far above. And within that column, Gabriel saw her, the Virgin Mary statue, but transformed beyond anything he could have imagined. The marble figure glowed with inner fire, her carved features somehow more lifelike than any human face. Centuries of prayers had indeed made her into something more than stone. She had become a living embodiment of divine mercy, a bridge between human suffering and cosmic compassion. "My child," the statue spoke, her voice containing multitudes, every prayer that had ever been offered to her, every tear shed in her presence, every moment of hope kindled by her gentle expression. "You have learned that true faith requires not the absence of doubt, but the courage to act with love despite uncertainty." Gabriel approached the glowing figure with reverence, understanding that he was in the presence of something sacred beyond his comprehension. The Virgin Mary extended one marble hand toward him, and Gabriel felt the same warmth he had experienced during his most profound moments of prayer. "The covenant can be restored," she continued, "but not as it was before. Your act of desecration, while born of pain, has created an opportunity for the sacred bond to become stronger than ever. You have learned truths that could only be discovered through suffering and redemption." Gabriel carefully lifted the statue, surprised to find that, despite her obvious spiritual power, she felt no heavier than ordinary marble. The three guardian spirits watched approvingly as he secured the sacred figure against his chest, understanding that he was now carrying not just a religious artifact, but the spiritual foundation of his entire community. "When you return to the surface," Elena's spirit said, her form beginning to fade as Gabriel's mission neared completion, "remember that redemption is not an ending, but a beginning. The real work starts when you climb out of this water and dedicate the rest of your life to living up to the trust that has been placed in your hands." Gabriel felt himself rising through the luminous water, the Virgin Mary statue secure in his arms, and the three sacred medals around his neck pulsing with synchronized energy. As he ascended, he could see the surface far above glowing with the same warm light that surrounded him, indicating that the supernatural flood was beginning to transform from judgment into blessing. The guardian spirits accompanied him partway to the surface before fading into the luminous depths, their final words echoing in Gabriel's heart. "Remember what you have learned here. Share it with those who have the courage to listen. And never forget that love is the only force strong enough to bridge any divide." Gabriel broke through the surface of the river to find the entire gathered community waiting on the shore, their faces reflecting a mixture of hope, fear, and wonder. The water around him no longer glowed with the eerie phosphorescence of supernatural judgment, but with the warm, golden light of divine approval. Bishop Morales was the first to speak, his voice thick with emotion as he stared at the transformed statue in Gabriel's arms. "She's beautiful," the bishop whispered, tears streaming down his face. I can actually see the prayers that have been offered to her over the centuries. They're like light, surrounding her with love." Gabriel waded toward shore, feeling the ordinary laws of physics reassert themselves as he left the sacred depths behind. The Virgin Mary statue had returned to her normal marble appearance, but Gabriel could still sense the tremendous spiritual energy contained within her carved form. "The covenant is restored," Gabriel announced to the gathered community, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced divine judgment and emerged transformed. But we all have work to do to maintain it. The river spirit has forgiven our failures, but it expects us to prove worthy of that forgiveness through our actions. As Gabriel stepped onto the shore, the floodwaters began their retreat, flowing back toward the normal river channel with supernatural speed and precision. But the lessons learned in the depths would remain with the community forever, a reminder that genuine faith requires both humility and courage. 6 months after the great flood, Gabriel stood in the memorial garden he had created from the ruins of his destroyed mansion. The insurance settlement had been generous, but every dollar had gone toward restoring the charitable programs that Bishop Morales had dismantled. Elena's scholarship fund was not only restored but expanded, now supporting 12 young women pursuing careers in healthcare and social service. The memorial garden occupied the exact spot where his mansion's living room had once showcased his material success. Now, smooth riverstones formed walking paths between native plants that Elena had loved, creating a space for reflection and prayer that served the entire community. At the garden's heart sat a simple bench carved from limestone taken from the sacred riverbed, inscribed with Elena's favorite verse about love enduring beyond death. Gabriel's living quarters were now limited to a small apartment behind the church, furnished with only the essentials needed for his pastoral duties. The transition from mansion to modest quarters had been surprisingly liberating, freeing him from the burden of maintaining possessions that had ultimately meant nothing in the face of genuine spiritual calling. Dr. Sarah Chen approached through the garden paths, her medical bag replaced by a folder containing reports from the free clinic that now operated out of the church's renovated basement. The clinic served anyone in the community regardless of their ability to pay, funded by the recovered money from Bishop Morales's fraudulent accounts and supported by volunteers who had been inspired by Gabriel's transformation. The monthly reports, Sarah said, settling beside Gabriel on the limestone bench. 57 patients treated this month, 3 surgical procedures arranged through our charity partnerships, and 2 families connected with addiction counseling services. Elena would be proud of what her fund has accomplished. Gabriel accepted the reports with a sense of quiet satisfaction that had replaced the driving ambition of his earlier ministry. Success was now measured not in membership numbers or building funds, but in lives touched and suffering alleviated. The church had returned to its fundamental mission of serving those whom society overlooked. "Any word from Bishop Morales?" Sarah asked, knowing that Gabriel maintained correspondence with his former adversary despite the painful history between them. "He's adjusting well to his new assignment," Gabriel replied, thinking of the remote parish in New Mexico where Morales now served as an ordinary priest rather than a diocesan administrator. The bishop had requested the demotion himself after making full restitution for his thefts, choosing penance over prosecution. He says, "The simplicity of parish work has reminded him why he entered ministry in the first place." Father Thomas emerged from the church building, his youthful energy now tempered by the wisdom that came from witnessing genuine spiritual transformation. As Gabriel's appointed successor, Thomas had taken on many of the administrative duties that once consumed Gabriel's time, allowing the older pastor to focus on counseling and spiritual direction. "The river blessing ceremony is ready," Thomas announced, referring to the monthly ritual they had instituted to honor the renewed covenant with the sacred waters. "Maria has the altar prepared, and the Native American representatives have arrived for the joint ceremony." The blending of Christian and indigenous traditions had initially caused controversy within the denomination, but the undeniable spiritual fruits of the arrangement had gradually won over even the most conservative critics. The monthly blessing ceremonies drew participants from across the region, creating bridges between communities that had been divided for generations. Gabriel walked toward the river, carrying the Virgin Mary statue that had been permanently relocated to an outdoor shrine beside the water. The statue's appearance had been subtly but permanently changed by her time in the sacred depths. Her marble features now seemed to shift subtly, depending on the viewer's spiritual needs, sometimes appearing as the traditional European Madonna, other times reflecting the indigenous Earth Mother that had been honored at this site for centuries. The gathered community formed a circle around the riverside shrine, their faces reflecting the diversity that had become characteristic of their renewed congregation. Former parishioners stood beside Native American elders, recent converts beside lifelong believers, wealthy donors beside families barely scraping by financially. The supernatural events that had nearly destroyed their community had ultimately revealed its true strength, the capacity to embrace differences while finding unity in shared commitment to love and service. As Gabriel began the blessing ceremony, he noticed Elena's presence in ways both subtle and profound. She no longer appeared as a visible spirit, but her influence pervaded every aspect of their transformed community life. Her medical knowledge lived on in the free clinic. Her compassion for young women continued through the expanded scholarship program, and her faith in redemption was proven daily through the changed lives that surrounded them. Today we remember that sacred waters flow not just in rivers, but in the tears of compassion, the sweat of service, and the blood of sacrifice that binds communities together. Gabriel spoke to the gathered circle. We remember that covenants are not maintained by perfection, but by the courage to seek forgiveness when we fall short, and the commitment to do better tomorrow than we did yesterday. The statue seemed to glow gently in the afternoon sunlight as Gabriel concluded the blessing. Children from the community came forward to place wildflowers around the shrine's base, their innocent faith serving as a reminder that spiritual truth often reveals itself most clearly through simple acts of love. As the ceremony concluded and the community began to disperse, Gabriel remained beside the river, listening to the gentle sound of water flowing over stones. The current ran clear and peaceful now, no longer carrying the supernatural luminescence of divine judgment, but still unmistakably sacred in its purpose and power. Gabriel pulled Elena's wedding ring from his pocket. He still carried it every day, but no longer as a talisman of grief. Instead, it had become a reminder of love's capacity to transform pain into purpose, loss into service, and individual brokenness into community healing. "Thank you," Gabriel whispered to the flowing water, addressing Eleanor, the river spirit, and the divine presence that connected all life. "Thank you for showing me that redemption is always possible, even for those who think they've fallen too far to climb back to grace." The river murmured its ancient song of forgiveness and renewal, carrying Gabriel's gratitude downstream to join the eternal cycle of blessing that would flow long after his own earthly service had ended.